Reinhard C. Fedder was born in Michigan City on June the 6th, 1876, on Manhattan Street, just south of 11th. His wife of 48 years, Nellie Lamka, bore him 5 sons and 1 daughter. One of his sons, Francis, would become mayor in 1953. Franny's son, Tom, would carry on the family name to become city clerk. 2 years after finishing the second term as mayor, on February 17, 1948, Hemp died from complications following prostate surgery. His career involved a variety of business pursuits, with his later years being devoted mainly to public service. He served as mayor from 1935 through 1938, and again from 1943 to 1947, defeating the incumbent Republican Fred Parker in 1942. Along with 6th-term Mayor Martin Krieger, it can be fairly said that Hemp Fedder and MT, as Mayor Krieger was affectionately called, did more to change the face and character of our city and determine its future than all of their counterparts combined. German-born Martin Krieger was a successful and respected attorney and state legislator. Krieger was largely self-educated, at the same time possessing the work ethic and solid German values that would create the priceless legacy the city continues to enjoy today. His unique vision, coupled with a singular and benevolent guile, secured Washington Park, and subsequently our entire East Lakefront forever in the public domain. As state legislator, he wrote a bill in 1896 that enabled Michigan City to create the state's first of its kind park department and to acquire land for park use. Then in the early 30s, utilities mogul Sam Insull, abetted by some local scalawags, plotted to gobble up the local water company for peanuts. He then planned to sock it to the city for hydrant rental and the unsuspecting homeowners in the form of unregulated water rates. Their plot was scotched by 3 businessmen who smelled a rat and got an injunction in federal court in South Bend shutting down the nefarious scheme. Krieger then wrote and shepherded the bill through the state legislature, which enabled the creation of the first water department of its kind in Indiana. Mayor Harry Tuttle appointed W. W. Vail, one of the whistleblowers, as its first president. Hemp then played a heavy hand in acquiring the funds for our modern filtration plant. It was Martin Krieger's eventual successor, however, the more earthy but equally dedicated and energetic Fedder, who seized Krieger's vision and polished the gem that is Washington Park as we know it today. This, the crown jewel in the tiara of South Lake Michigan's sunny shore, remains his greatest legacy. It continues to cast Michigan City in a warm and enviable light. Now Hemp was also a savvy politician, but is probably better described in the best sense as a hustler. He gave new dimension to the word chutzpah, as we shall presently see. As a small boy, Hemp would be reading in the pulp magazines of that post-Civil War Wild West era that often exaggerated exploits and demise of such icons as Wyatt Earp, General Custer, and Jesse James. He would have visited the always busy train station, harbor, and waterfront, the docks along Trail Creek, reaching all the way up to a second turning basin above the present E Street Bridge. He certainly climbed Hoosier Slide, the bald mountain of sand at the mouth of Trail Creek. From this commanding height, he could watch 2- and 3-masted schooners and steam-powered packets approaching the harbor, or see his bustling city with boats of all kinds lining the creek, docked prow to stern, busily offloading salt, stone, or fish, while others were taking on cargoes of pork, lumber, coal, and flour, the latter having been ground, or the lumber sawed and planed in one of the 40-odd water mills that dotted LaPorte County, in the last century, 17 on Trail Creek alone. The Christopher Reske Dam and Flowering Mill, located where US 35 crosses Trail Creek, was one of the largest, its mill pond reaching almost back to present-day US 20. The increasing number of trains and the excitement they created at the various passenger stations was shared by kids and adults alike. As he grew to manhood, however, by the turn of the century, most of the timber had been clear-cut, the acreage turned into farmland. The railroads had taken over most of the freight business. Michigan City's glory days as one of Lake Michigan's busiest ports had come to a close. But Mayor Martin Krieger in 1891, serving also in that day as president of the city council, and having wisely kept his radical vision of a lakefront park to himself, had gotten a new Franklin Street bridge built. He now shamelessly maneuvered a stubborn, sharply divided council into buying the land that would become Washington Park. Nothing across that creek but sand, please, and squatters, and those damn ex-convicts from the prison. Should let the steel mills have it. Bring jobs, $50,000, what a waste of our tax money. Following Mayor Krieger's brilliant coup, this was undoubtedly the sort of talk that circulated through the numerous bars, euphemistically called buffets in those days. These dispensaries of liquor, wine, and spirits lined Franklin Street and dotted the various ethnic neighborhoods of the city. The same carping chorus of public and politicians alike that had scoffed at the purchase of Central Park in New York, that would rail at the acquisition of Chicago's forest preserves or the retention of Grant Park as inviolable green space, clacked their self-righteous objections here as well. This vital acquisition by Mayor Krieger determined Michigan City's future, our character and self-image, as no other before or since. This drama is described in Elizabeth Munger's book, Michigan City's First 100 Years. By the turn of the century, then, the city was taking on a new mien. As a tourist destination, a place for all sorts of diversions. Snarltown, the red light district at the foot of Hoosier Slide, which had accommodated the dock wallopers and the sailors of the previous era, did not soon fade away. Michigan City, also with its notorious concentration of taverns, had established itself as a city for sin, a reputation which carried right into Hemp's first term prior to World War II.
So we came here to Michigan City, and there were 35 houses of prostitution operating openly, some with neon signs, slot machines in every drugstore, grocery store, any place you could put them. And to us, this was unbelievable. The whole openness of the scene was absolutely 100% opposed to where we came from. So it was a great shock to us to see such license, and we knew the Nayases very well. And when we went in business later in 1928, we started a lumberyard on 10th Street, and the Nayases were among our first and best customers. They had at that time I think 7 different operations going, and they were always closing one and starting another. If the heat got on, they'd close that one and start another one. And they drove Lincoln LeBarons, which was a custom-made automobile. At that time, the absolute top in automobile luxury. And it was a fascinating experience as I think back on it, almost unbelievable.
Michigan City was a sin city in the 30s. And during Hemp's term, Hemp was a township trustee during the period of many bean tickets, they call them, food gifts from the township.
We call them food stamps today, right?
They call them food stamps today. Well, you can imagine how many votes and friends he was making as township trustee. in 1933 when I went to work as a green cub for the Dispatch, and watched with fascination his whole process. In 1934, became a candidate for mayor, got elected. My Lord, he had a ton of friends. See? And then 34 to 38, he was the mayor. But during that time, I would say we had slot machines in every institution in town except church vestibules, and some of them were kind of wanting them, but they got the better of it. If the News Dispatch knew we had just the Dispatch, if the newspaper started crusading against gambling and stuff, boy, the merchants came down on them like a ton of bricks. Because most of the merchants in this deep, deep depression were paying their rent with the slot machines they had in the corner.
How did that work?
Well, the merchants, as I recall, 50-50 deal. Merchants got half, and the slot machine owner got half of the take. And once, along about 34, 35, we figured out that the number of slot machines there were in Michigan City were sucking more than $50,000 a month out of the economy. Gone. Went into the pockets of the racketeers that owned the slot machine.
Who were?
Well, let them rest in peace. One of them owned the prosecutor, the other one owned the mayor's office or the local police, and that's how they operated. And we got on the tail of them, and we followed them around. They were not happy when they found that the press was following him. So finally, about 20-some slot machines they'd gathered up. Constable had the authority to do this, to confiscate them. And he took them out to someplace near the old Reliance Manufacturing Company on Chicago Street. Remember where that was?
Yep.
And of course, now we're asking, what are you going to do with these machines, John? Well, he said, we're going to have to get a court action and destroy them, you know. So about 11 o'clock, we gave up and went home. And the next thing we know, the telephone's ringing and said, hey, guess what? Somebody just confiscated all of John's slot machines except a couple old junkers. I said, what? Oh, yeah, there's a big rhubarb went on. Some thugs came marching in on the constable's deputies and just simply muscled them and took back the slot machines and drove away in a truck. Well, the next day we sent a photographer out real quick. John had somehow saved 5 slot machines out of the 20-some that he had. But all of these were old. Most of them were old. 2 or 3 were still pretty good machines. So we took a picture of him with these junker machines, with these 5 slot machines that he had saved from the hijackers. Well, this resulted in a grand jury investigation. And this was going on with, headlines every day. Grand jury's got this one running in and that one running in, and various and sundry city officials were somehow avoiding it. But in the midst of it, the constable John Gondik testified that he had he called us on the telephone one day. We kept asking him, when are you going to smash those machines? When are you going to smash those machines? He said, we want to be there when you do it with the photographer. He calls one day, he said, I finally smashed those machines you've been on me about. So I said, what do you mean? He said, well, I already smashed them. Come on, take a picture. I said, you were going to let us take your picture actually smashing them. Well, he said I had to get us done. Okay, we went out, we took pictures of him. wielding the axe on already smashed slot machines. So we went back and brought back the pictures and the film and developed it and ran a picture in the paper of him smashing the slot machine. That night I got a quiet telephone call. By that time I had some sources among those people. And the guy said, "You don't really think that John would smash those brand new machines that you showed a picture of the day after the raid?" I said, "The thought never occurred to me." He said, "Well, it better occur to you. You have a picture of the machines with him the day they were taken, and you have a picture of the smashed ones. Why don't you put those photos together and see what you conclude?" Well, it was very easy to conclude. All you had to do was take 2 looks at those pictures and look at the slot, ancient curled slots on the ancient machines that were smashed, and the brand new machines with the different kind of a slot. Every one of them were different. So obviously what had happened, those good new machines were worth probably $200-300 a piece, even in those dry days, when things were so low, when the Depression was on. So we wrote a story. The grand jury was in session, and Gondik had already testified that he had smashed the machines that he confiscated. So we wrote a story with a little twist that said, somebody played a dirty trick on Constable Gondik. It must have been a dirty trick because surely he wouldn't have smashed 5 old junker machines instead of the 5 that he confiscated. Surely not John Gondik, not Constable Gondik. And then when the paper came out, we took the photographs and we took the paper over across the street to the grand jury. Mark Storn was the prosecutor. He was conducting the investigation. And we presented him with this evidence. He didn't seem to be very happy, but presented it to the grand jury, and as a consequence, Gondik got indicted for perjury, and they came very close to indicting one of Hemp's sons. I think it was Lenny was the one who was the slot machine mechanic, because they had a witness who was almost willing to identify him as one of those raiders who came and took the 20-some machines back the night they were hijacked.
Now with the ultimate acquisition of the whole East Lakefront in 1891, Washington Park was becoming a mecca as well for couples and families seeking more wholesome forms of recreation. As Lakeshore Drive was pushed eastward, summer cottages were starting to go up, and the city began to see itself more and more as a resort community. Around the turn of the century, streams of day visitors were riding the Monon up from Lafayette and Indianapolis, or making day trips here by passenger ship from Chicago. They toured the prison, went swimming, rode the roller coaster, or climbed awesome Hoosier Slide, perhaps to join in one of the weddings which often took place on its bald summit. As the new century opened, Michigan City was changing. Gone were the lumber and the flouring mills along Trail Creek, the slaughterhouses. Indoor toilets and sewers were replacing the privies and reeking open ditches like Rommel, Cheney Run, and Fish Lake Creek, which crossed Franklin Street between 4th and Market, later named 5th Street. All these, of course, finding their way to Trail Creek and the lake. Now the country was being called the Great Melting Pot, and Michigan City was getting its share of those huddled masses yearning to breathe free. Following the initial settlement of the northern Indiana counties by well-to-do Yankees of Scotch and English stock, a constant stream of immigrants were leaving Europe. German, Scandinavian, Polish, Irish, and in our particular case, Syrian and Lebanese, more or less in that order. Those huddled masses had read the advertisements of American factory owners and land speculators, of whom, by the way, our city's founder, Major Isaac C. Elston, was one of the first. Men were making the painful decisions to leave their homeland for good, to send for family or kin as soon as they had earned their passage in the New World. The streams of typically impoverished immigrants were leaving the farms of their titled aristocratic landlords and oppressive European governments to flesh out the hamlets and towns already created by their more affluent predecessors. The railroads, subsidized by a clever policy of federal land grants to them, created and promoted new towns, thereby speeding up rural settlement at an amazing pace. The immigrants, finding the small enclaves of fellow countrymen who eased the transition to the new language, were working the docks, making furniture, raising corn and hogs, or building freight cars. Capitalism had found a new and fertile field in America. Over here, economic democracy was giving the nations of Europe and the world a solid lesson in the production of wealth. Coupled with the massive influx of labor was a land of seemingly limitless natural resources and fertile land. The United States soon surpassed England as the world's largest economy. Abuses came inevitably. As the century came to a close, the so-called robber barons, Carnegie and Rockefeller, Swift and Armour, Harriman and Vanderbilt, emerged amassing huge fortunes prior to the graduated income tax and the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1913. At the same time, these seekers after freedom brought with them some ingrained European, and to their employers, radical ideas about economic justice and equalization of the wealth they were helping to produce. Socialism, and soon communism, had become the language of the dollar-a-day factory worker, the exploited packing house employee, and the 10-cent-an-hour seamstress. Capitalists like George Pullman in Hegewisch and our own John Barker sought to mollify the radicals and grumblers with their own self-styled paternalism, or, when this was rejected, to enlist the police and the scabs to break the strikes that inevitably broke out. Local historian Dude Calvert estimated that there may have been as many as 500 of these rubber-stamped, two-bedroom, subsidized Pullman houses scattered within walking distance of the car shops. This one at the corner of 4th and Wabash Streets was bought and restored by the preservationists as a lasting memorial to the Haskell and Barker Car Company, its founder, and the workers who collectively defined Michigan City to such a great degree. The undercurrent of bitterness that pervaded the working class during the first 3 decades of the century in a way manifested itself in the bullet that remains lodged in the frame of a china cabinet in the dining room of the Barker mansion. The would-be assassin's bullet was intended for Mr. Barker, but missed its mark. At the same time, millions of dollars were coming to the city through the Haskell and Barker Car Company. The second John Barker, and subsequently his daughter Catherine, paid for, wholly or in part, Barker Hall, the first YMCA, St. Anthony Hospital, our first library, and the Washington Park Bandstand. The Barker Foundation continues to enrich the city through yearly grants to various non-profit organizations. The mansion was given to the city in 1972 and continues to remind us of a certain grandeur that was an important part of our city's past. Hemp had his first calling as a popular and successful barber. In 1902, he was operating a shop at 513 West Boston Street, now West 10th Street, just a short walk from his home at 1012 Manhattan Street. This picture shows the street being paved with cedar blocks, a vast improvement over the rutted, muddy, or dusty lane that led to the prison. Those blocks, however, had a great tendency to rise and float away after a heavy rainstorm. A short time later, a good dancer himself, Hemp also became a dancing teacher. His entry into politics came in 1913 as a member of the Board of Works. In December of 1918, Hemp was awarded a contract for $150 a month to move the mail between the post office and the various train stations. Eastbound or westbound, in those days much of the mail was sorted en route aboard special mail cars, included in the numerous passenger cars that served the city. In 1913, he was also serving as manager of the Ames 2nd Regimental Band, the predecessor to our municipal band. Gregarious and popular, Hemp was a charter member of the Eagles Lodge and remained a member of the Elks for 25 years. After World War I, he operated a roller skating rink where the Armory now stands. His ambition and popularity prompted him to seek a variety of political offices. In the Democratic primary of 1918, he ran for sheriff, placing 5th in a field of 8. He was serving at this time also as deputy customs collector. Now, with World War I coming to a close, another giant would take his place in the annals of Michigan City. Walter K. Greenebaum was hired in August of 1918 to be secretary of the newly formed Chamber of Commerce. With the decline of the once bustling port and the removal of the Michigan Central Railroad's division point and repair shops to Niles, the city was in the economic doldrums. This energetic and affable promoter had already distinguished himself in Chicago as manager of the Indiana Transportation Company. Their flagship, the SS Theodore Roosevelt, had been making regular day trips during the summer to Washington Park prior to his arrival. A young Benny Goodman, by the way, was sharpening his musical skills as a member of the band that played aboard the ship. Walter knew our city well, having promoted Washington Park and our beaches as the perfect destination for a day of family fun. During his 25-year stint as Chamber Secretary, using his business contacts in Chicago, he is credited with almost single-handedly luring as many as 25 industries to the city. Walter, we could use you now. Thus, Michigan City, after the brief post-war depression, caught the wave of the 20s boom. Prior to World War I, a high percentage of the city's workforce had been made up of unskilled labor. Now new jobs were being created, calling for better paid skilled machinists and craftsmen and educated managers. It was even said that some of the owners of established businesses resented having to raise their wages to compete in the local labor market, even seeking to dampen Greenebaum's enthusiasm and success. Their concern became moot on October 29, 1929, and the onset of the Great Depression. Hemp had served on the Board of Works, but his first full-time political job came in 1928 when he was appointed to fill the vacancy in the office of Michigan Township Trustee. He easily won election to the office the following terms. Now the Depression was on the land, and Michigan City was feeling its full brunt. From a peak production of 54 cars a day, with a workforce of 2,800 men, Pullman, or the car shops as they were called, was now completely closed down, the moan of its steam whistle each noon no longer heard. Unemployment was running at 25%. Men were cashing in their precious life insurance policies to keep their family from starvation. In 1935, war veterans left the so-called Hoovervilles, the tin and cardboard shanty towns ringing the major cities, and marched on Washington, demanding that their promised veterans' pensions be paid. Now the township trustee, as virtually the only source of succor to the poor and unemployed, became the city's angel of mercy. Here's Roger McKee to tell about this desperate time.
The people would come from the state to check up on how much money he was spending and so on and so forth. And they were being critical of him for giving away too much food and too much the relief orders and so on. And so he or some of them arranged to get a lot of poor people, just these ago, a mob, to come down there. And they started hollering and ranting and raving. And Deke Morris is a big old dock walloper. He, started about hang them, get those belly robbers down out of there, and so on. And so they were really afraid to come down out of they're in the township trustee's office, I guess, at that time was at Michigan and Franklin. So Hemp, as I understand it, came out and said, "Hey, fellas, they're just doing their job. They're trying their best, and these are tough times, so on and so forth. But get them, and so on." And so the end of that story, I guess, is they left and they didn't come back. And of course, Hemp was, a kid comes in and needed a pair of shoes, or he wrote the order. If they needed coal keep the house warm, he'd write the order.
In November of 1934, Reinhard Fedder was elected mayor over Republican Charles Least by a margin of 1,520 votes. Incumbent Republican Mayor H.B. Tuttle chose not to run. With his background as an aggressive businessman and record in local politics, Hemp hit the ground running when he took office the following January. Some of the projects in Washington Park were already underway when he took the executive reins. He quickly sensed and took advantage of the new federal make-work policies of President Roosevelt's New Deal. An incredible $5 billion had been appropriated to fund the Public Works Administration and the Works Progress Administration, both designed to infuse hard cash directly into local economies through the creation of various public projects. The Elston High School Auditorium, which replaced the barn, our hallowed but antiquated old wood gym, was one such project. Our modern filtration plant and first full-fledged sewage disposal facility were built under Hemp's first reign. The Amesfield Stadium was also created at this time. Here's Joe LaRocco to tell about the dedication of that Southside landmark.
Amesfield was dedicated Thanksgiving Day, 1938. Hemp Fedder was the mayor, Reinhard C. Fedder. He was the mayor, and I was the booking agent for our Coca-Cola Raiders semi-pro team. And he said, I'd like to have Amesfield dedicated. Would you pick up the team and an opponent so we can dedicate it? And I said, I think I can do that. So I did. We dedicated Amesfield Thanksgiving Day, 1938, and played Hoosier Bears from South Bend. And we lost that game 6-0. But it was a very difficult field because Amesfield was designed as a baseball field, not football. So they had a high mound, and they had a lot of clay and sand, which was not appropriate for football. And later on, they cut down the mound and everything and made it to a playable field. The field goals were put in the ground and removable so they could play baseball. And they had them on both ends. They had a recess in there. They put the goalpost in there, and then end of the season they'd pull them out. And the east side of the field was canvas. There wasn't brick there at the time.
The additions and upgrading of Washington Park and the zoo were outgrowths of these federal programs as well. Most grants came directly to the city with comparative ease, bypassing the red tape of the state bureaucracy. When direct action at the state level was called for, however, our intrepid mayor demonstrated his moxie. Here's the late Richard Frame, city engineer under Fedder, to underscore the can-do spirit that epitomized Fedder's political mystique.
We had a PWA project in and approved to build new docks in Michigan City, the city docks. There was 600 feet on each side of the harbor. And they were in real bad shape because all of the wood was rotted above the water line. And also for some little distance below the water line, because the water line fluctuates greatly depending on the wind over Lake Michigan. And so Larry Cannon was doing all of the legal work that was necessary to get it done. We had submitted plans sketches to the Corps of Engineers for their approval, and they were very slow in acting. And so we finally, after about 3 or 4 months or more, and nothing was happening, the Corps of Engineers had then by that time approved it, and everything was clear, and we were proceeding to get the final thing done. And here come a message from Indianapolis that they had canceled our project because we weren't getting started. And we went down there and tried to tell them that legally we couldn't start any earlier, and showed them evidence that of the legal work that it was required, and we could only go so fast. And but that didn't faze them at all. They had given it to somebody else. So Hemp called someone in either the House of Representatives or the Senate to arrange for us to talk to somebody in Washington about it. So we went to Washington.
You and Hemp?
Yes, Hemp and I and his son Francis and Larry Cannon. And I don't know why some other car wasn't available, but my car was. So I drove. And in the Pennsylvania area somewhere, and I don't remember exactly it was, we hit a very bad fog. And it was difficult to see through the windshield. And so Francis rode on the left front fender for quite a while because I was driving only about 10 or 15 miles an hour. And because visibility was about 50 feet, you just couldn't see. And so that was pretty slow, but finally we did get through it. And so the next day in Washington, we were ushered into Colonel Hackett's office, and so he arranged for 2 secretaries to take our complaint, and he did. And so after that, after he heard what had been done, he called Indianapolis, the state director, and he almost fired him.
Is PWA a director?
PWA.
PM.
And so our project was reinstated immediately.
Aiding and abetting Mayor Fedder's efforts to enhance Washington Park and the zoo was the Zoo Board. This self-appointed group of businessmen was a fortuitous blend of hijinks, business sense, and zeal, compounded with a good measure. of, well, here's the late Harry Fry to talk about the kingpin of the singularly dedicated booster club, the scrounger extraordinaire, Tom T.C. Mullen.
Yeah.
He'd steal the buttons off your vest if it was for the park.
For the city.
Yeah.
Oh.
The most marvelous horse trader that ever was. He'd steal things right out from under your nose, but because you knew it was going for the park, you looked the other way. Pullman and the South Shore and Joy Manufacturing, or Sullivan, half of their profits went into the park with the cooperation of everybody concerned because they knew where it was going. Tom was a manipulator out of this world.
Yeah.
He and Nate Rosenberg, and there were some other thieves of that type. And they put that park together out of scratch.
Yeah.
I think one of the memories that comes through on him, every time he had 3 martinis, he wore a toupee, a wig. What do they call them now today?
A rug?
A rug. And after the 3rd martini, he would always get cocked off on one side. And he'd look strange the rest of the evening. But they used to kid him about that. He said, "What do I care?" But he was a remarkable guy. A lot of bad things went on during his administration, and a lot of good things too. He was a mover and shaker. He got things done. But then he had a park board made of Tom Mullen, the attorney, and Art Logman, who ran Pullman, and Joe Bisbee, who ran the Smith Brothers Cough Shop. Those 2 guys were some of the most skillful community thieves that you ever saw. And those were the days of the WPA. And in order to get a WPA project, labor alone, from the federal government, you had to produce a fair amount of materials or money to buy materials. In other words, it was a share and share thing.
Kind of an in-kind.
In-kind. Oh, yeah, in-kind was fine.
We call it today.
The type of thing, Tom Mullen was one of the finest benefactors of this community because he knew how to steal with great finesse. For example, the Monon Railroad, as you may recall, ran by the armory and delivered sugar.
Tank cars. To Smith Brothers.
To Smith Brothers. Well, that was Monon land, all down along the harbor there. So without saying anything to Monon, or maybe just telling Monon what he was going to do, Mullen made a deal with the big stone company, which was supplying some of our highway stone, to rent that land as an offloading place. Then he did 2 things. He collected from the stone company for rent for land which somebody else owned it, didn't know. I guess the Monon owned it, but nobody cared. And then when the stone company unloaded the big ships would come in and they'd spend 2 or 3 days unloading the crushed stone or the gravel or whatever it was that they were bringing in that time. The park department's trucks would just be moving in there like little ants, gobbling it up, just plain stealing it. The stone company didn't care. They got a good deal on the lease and everybody was happy. Well, all that material then went into a WPA project, Works Progress Administration project, and that's how all of those improvements in Washington Park got made.
Area golfers today readily acknowledge that ours is one of the best municipal golf courses in this region. And thereby hangs another tale of this man and his single-minded dedication to the enrichment, the quality of life that we enjoy today. Here's the late Stan Henry, the town's all-time favorite barber, to tell how another of Hemp's coups came about, this one during his 2nd term.
And Hemp was there when they built Ames Field with the help of the government.
This tree right around this way here?
And the
This whole tree over
Naval
right
Armory, the fountain at Ames Field, the tower and the zoo at the lake, and Hemp was instrumental in all of that. And about that time, the golf course was about to be used for something else. And the fellows from FDIC someplace came out to look it over. And Hemp says, well, now we got some valleys here with creeks running through, and they flood. You wouldn't want to plant crops there because after a rain they flood. He said up on the hill past the creek on number 5 fairway, he had them up there, and he took his toe and dug it in that hard clay ground. The grass was dry, there was hardly any grass there, and he kicked that toe in the ground. Dust rose up and it was hard. Golfers hated to hit an iron shot off of that bank because it was so hard, that high bank. And Hemp says, look at this ground. It wouldn't raise anything. You couldn't even grow potatoes here.
Concurrently, while all these marvelous capital improvements were going on, there was another darker aspect in Michigan City, and LaPorte County too for that matter, during this racking, sobering time. The town was wide open. The corruption that found particular focus in our city engulfed municipal, township, and county officials, as well as the law, in a network of bribery, payoffs, and protection that could have been a model for today's mafia rule. The Nahas brothers, George and Jack, controlled most of the gambling and the rampant institutionalized prostitution that, in addition to serving the local populace, attracted a sporting crowd for miles around. The brothers had already established themselves in the business of vice and gambling, and the political system that enabled them to entrench themselves well before Fedder took office as mayor. It pays the rent, one Southside grocer said, shrugging and nodding to the slot machine placed obtrusively and unabashedly beside his front door. Here's Roger again, who lived on the west side in those days and was snatched from the clutches of sin by his wise mom.
Now, nickel, during that Depression, that was a lot of money. That's what ice cream cones cost, a nickel. So my sister, we lived on Lincoln Avenue, and that's only a few blocks away from Doc Sudrow's, who was on Willard Avenue. And he said, my sister said, whatever she wanted, she gave me the money, she said, and there's a nickel for you in there. So I went there. And there was a slot machine in Doc Sudrow's thing for nickel. Now maybe that's why I learned to gamble, because I was thinking, I could go bought 5 cents worth of candy or that ice cream cone, but there was like a Coke box. I stepped up on, I put that nickel in there, and I pulled the thing and it hit the jackpot. Now, I got the money, and there was a couple of old guys sitting there, and they said, "Hey, kid, you really did it. Hey, you know." It probably, maybe it was $3 or whatever it was. It come tumbling out of there. So I got a sack, and on a little sack, put the money in there. On the way back home, I thought, what am I going to do with all that money? And there's a place we called Marfica's Hill, 8th and Lincoln Avenue. On the way home, I met, I think it was Dale DeLacy, who went to school with us. And we talked. I said, "Hey, here." I give him a handful of nickels. You know, and he, "What's the, I said, I forget what I called the slot machine. Well, I got home. Oh, no, I went up and up hill, there was a tree where a big root came out, and I took that money and put in that bag, and I put it way back in there, I thought, well, I can always come and get what I need. You know, I get home, and my mother says, "I just got a call from," I think it was Mrs. Lacey. She said her boy came home with a handful of nickels that you gave him where'd you get the money? I hemmed and hawed a little bit. I told her. She says, you mean to tell me you played the slot machine? I said, well, I didn't want any candy. I didn't want to. Well, the end of that story was I went back and dug out the sack of nickels and took them home and given them to my mother.
The wages of communal sin that were paid out and collected oiled the machinery of government and quietly eased the financial woes of those retailers and clubs who joined the game. At this point, if we may be permitted a small aside, the comparative dribble of illicit gambling money of that era is now a gusher of state-sanctioned fuel for the very engines of government in our city and across the state. The devil, it seems, now wears the white hat. But enough moralizing. Here's an old friend, the consummate journalist, the crusader without cape, to give us the real story, as he indeed lived it. Hemp was known to show his understanding of practical politics on more than one occasion. Even if not an active participant in sports, Hemp liked and promoted them. At the same time, he loved children. If he was not doing a picnic or taking a busload of kids to a Sox game, where he, true to form, cajoled the ticket taker into passing the whole bunch in free, he was throwing a Christmas party for a bunch of poor kids at the town club in the basement of the Spaulding Hotel. A former reporter for the Evening Dispatch, with a characteristic twinkle in her eye, described the happy event. Hemp, having presumably called George Nahas for an extra $75 donation, purchased toys and candy and hired a Santa Claus. The party was anxiously awaiting the Jolly Gent's arrival to distribute Christmas cheer to all. It seemed, however, that a bit too much Christmas cheer had already passed Santa's lips, and the jovial gent proceeded to pass out on the table. Without missing a beat, Mayor Fedder patted the slumbering Santa's head and announced, "Aw, poor Santa has been working so hard, he just needs to sleep for a while." Hemp was not averse to playing a little practical politics as well. Bill Burns helps illuminate yet another aspect of this nimble practitioner's style.
Or he and his wife doing the cakewalk at the Oasis. No one heard of that, and that was way back from 1900, that cakewalk, you know. And I think most of it is that the couple struts around the dance floor. So I remember him at a cakewalk at the down at the Oasis. He and his wife led that, and no one knew what a cakewalk was till they watched Hemp and his wife strut like this. This is back from the gay 90s. So I remember things like that about him. But he kept the town lively. That's what he had. Good community life and spirit. No question about it. Maybe the most colorful mayor we had. Of course, we were exposed to the brilliance of Martin T. Krieger. Certainly was a smart man. But Hemp was probably more of a leader. Yeah, even Martin T. So we remember him like that, a colorful leader, doing things all the time. Yes.
Concurrently, along with some of the more sordid aspects of Michigan city life, there was a definite quality, a palpable richness in that Depression-era society that unfortunately today's baby boomers and most likely future generations will never know. Whether by reason of our greatly increased mobility and the consequent dissolution of a certain over-the-back fence neighborliness, and reliance on family members and neighbors for material as well as spiritual support, a major change occurred. World War II broke the link and was the watershed for a way of life that only the baby boomers of World War I are still able to compare. The ratcheted up materialism that drives both parents into the workforce today evokes the well-worn good old days refrain. But they were, in so many ways, just that, good. Subconsciously, adults and kids knew where they belonged. There was a strong sense of place. Franklin Street, the streetcar, the big downtown stores, the Spaulding Hotel, the movies, church, was where it all happened, a closed, secure environment. Gossip on the street, cohesion, an overriding of communities. The regular Saturday night ride, or in many cases walk downtown for perhaps some yard goods at Karsten's, or a couple of pounds of nails at Steiger's, and the kids coming up from the popcorn stand at the corner of 8th to join their parents and some friends from church for a soda at Bodine's. Whether pre or post-stock market crash, there was a holistic quality to life in the city. Whether the car shops were running full blast or were closed down completely, there was still an overriding feeling of security, of belonging. Our school system, and especially our band, under the inspiration of Palmer Myron, were among the best in the state. Streets were safe. Pullman workers were moving out of those small, employer-subsidized copycat cottages with no bathroom. They were moving into larger two-story brick houses on DuPage, Homer, or Buffalo Street. The South Shore in the mid-20s, with an infusion of capital and skilled management by Sam Insel, was running as many as 81 trains a day, double today's number, at speeds that would put today's operators to shame. The occasional trip in to Marshall Fields was an event to be anticipated, savored, and remembered. There were dozens of small, family-owned grocery stores scattered every few blocks throughout the city, some catering to the preferences of the ethnic neighborhoods surrounding them. Italian, German, Polish, Syrian, Lebanese. Here the full-time housewife could find, besides the necessary bread, milk, and meat, a kindly word and even advice from her friend behind the counter. And lingering a bit, she almost always engaged in a gossipy chat with a neighbor also seeking relief from her midweek boredom. The 30s. This was the decade of 25% unemployment and widespread deprivation, of fear and despair. Across the country, banks were failing, depositors often losing their life savings. But unlike so many banks in Chicago and other cities, those in Michigan City did not fail. No deposits were lost. Teenagers of that generation thought nothing of hiking to the beach in the afternoon or to the oasis at night. The schizophrenia which allowed God-fearing, law-abiding folks to tolerate the blatant, obvious corruption of that era is not so odd, given our moral concessions of the 60s and the shameful turnout of citizens of voting age at the polls today. Will the present generation, and those that are to follow, draw inspiration from these giants of our past and come back home to expose the elements that have brought our once proud city to its present state? Is there an emergent iconoclast, a Rogers or Marquette graduate, out there with the brains, conviction, and the courage to take on the journeyman politicians at the local and state level and set a new course for the city? A blue water sailor, unlike the green water helmsman who clings fearfully to the shore, guided by fixed lights and landmarks? Or will the city find, out of its midst, another Martin Krieger, a blue water sailor who steers by the stars